As one of the most popular monsters, Brachydios has won numerous fans through his frequent displays of explosive power throughout the series, stemming chiefly from his unique relationship with the reactive slime mold. So let us suggest how this partnership began, and how it influenced Brachydios to become what he is today. As a big question anyone may have is how one gets from a more typical brute wyvern to a slime mold-loving punch exploder. But this tale as old as time likely didn't begin in a volcano, whilst many would likely suggest a volcano up hypothesis, that a small ancestor moved into a volcanic region, got slime, and then became larger and more dominant because of it. I personally posit a swamp in hypothesis. The Brachydios had a generalist ancestor that, in wetland environments, adopted the slime and then became marooned in the volcano by a changing world, and managed to adapt and grow. Slime molds as a group can tolerate very dry conditions, but reach their highest densities and biodiversity in damp, shady areas like rainforests or wetlands. So a partnership is more likely to develop in such areas too. These sorts of terrain also have more of a reason for an animal to rootle in their soil, and soil that encouraged it without huge specialization required. With rich amounts of invertebrate life as well as fungi, swamp environments would provide a greater stimuli for an animal to actually undertake actions that would bring it into regular contact with the slime mold. The slime would quickly benefit from this partnership by having a handy brute wyvern transport to move it between different points of rotting vegetation that it wants to eat. At this stage, the slime mold probably wasn't anywhere near as destructive as it is now, but presumably had some explosive spore method stronger than usual. The slime mold may have also been partly adopted for use in scent marking too. It's mentioned for Brachydios that they use the slime to denote territorial boundaries, which is a common theme in brute wyverns. Presumably the ancestor may have used the blast marks to accompany its diggings to mark territory too, but chiefly the Brachydios ancestor presumably benefited from the explosive slime mold improving foraging conditions, the detonating factor resulting in more soil unearthed, so less effort digging and more/deeper food unearthed, and insect nests in rotting wood are easier broken open to eat. A lot of social insects like the same things slime molds like, which is rotting wood and vegetation. So a brute ancestor foraging for such insects would likely come into contact with slime molds on a regular basis too. As I do think such insects may well have been a frequent food for the brute ancestor, for two reasons. One is the traits shared between the Myrmecophagous Baroth and Brachydios, like keratinous armour, extensive headgear, and well-developed forelimbs, but also Brachydios' seeming adaptations for Myrmecophagy too. Frequent traits seen in this diet morph include powerful forearms to break open new social insect nests, and enlarged salivary glands to help consume them. Indeed, to look at some of Brachydios' traits overall, many's first thought may well be anteater. As well as this, the idea of a generalist ancestor with traits for insect eating may be an alternate explanation for some other brute wyvern weirdness. Myrmecophage animals often eat a lot of grit when eating their bugs, just as Baroth still does. Maybe this is how rock-eating traits first developed in wyverns like Uragan, with them eventually developing sufficient gut bacteria that the soil became as or more nutritious than the insects. For many, including Brachydios, the brute ancestor may not have gone full anteater, as it was still more of a generalist feeder, that still benefited from those two traits in the general behaviour of unearthing food from the soil. So the two may have shared this hypothetical common ancestor, or perhaps the family, that in wetter period of the known world's history were a lot more widespread. Climate change isolated Baroth's ancestors in savannas and deserts, where it became semi-aquatic. Brachydios became isolated in volcanic areas, and as evolutionary time passed, the slime mold became dependent on Brachydios for distribution and lived permanently on its hide. And in this time it may take to eating Brachydios as well. While many would think Brachydios' tough, obsidian-like armour is indigestible, many would likely think the same of keratin, which can withstand the stomachs of even animals like crocodiles, vultures, and hyenas. But some moths have caterpillars that are essentially dependent on the horns of deceased ungulates, for both their food and cocoons, where they eat the keratin sheath on the bone horn core. There's actually a lot of mites and other small invertebrates that do this too, albeit in less overtly noticeable ways. Some fungi do as well. and this is the cause of illnesses like ringworm. For Brachydios, this may be another prompt for it to continuously grow its unique armour. The growth may not be uniform across the whole body, and strongly localised to the head and pounders, especially because the slime seems to live in the horn chiefly too. What looks like a solid mass of the armour is in fact a honeycombed structure that seems to be the chief breeding zone for the slime, and maybe where it moves to the rest of the body from. It could even be that a Brachydios with a broken horn could fail to produce slime at usual levels, or even at all. The Iceborne book believes there must be some factor that localises slime to the front half of the body, and constant shell regeneration could be one, especially as damage and wear incurred to the front would warrant constant growth anyway. The book tentatively suggests saliva as food for the slime, but slime mold typically eat what they're growing on, and the rates and density of slime mold growth and occupation would mean that Brachydios would essentially have to be coating itself in its own saliva near daily to achieve this, as it grows over the whole body. So the shell itself seems like the more reasonable food, as well as explaining why the slime mold becomes dormant when separating from Brachydios, who is also the food source. Brachydios itself moved from an ancestral broad diet of mixed fat, protein and carbohydrate as a generalist ground forager, to a diet entirely of protein in the form of other monsters due to minimal vegetation and fungal growth in volcanoes, as well as lessened insect densities. The pounders and the slime were still used for processing and unearthing food, albeit now it was tougher food in tougher volcanic rock, rather than damp soil or rotting wood, that only favoured those with the more potent slime. Brachydios and its slime ultimately became more powerful for the carnivorous diet in a less productive environment, and now may well have lost any generalist traits. On this, I think it can be worth scaling back to look at brutes as a family too. And despite being tyrannosaur or carnosaur-shaped animals, that may not be the most accurate comparison. The animal family they may more resemble in this regard is bears, who despite being viewed as a family of carnivores and part of the order Carnivora, have a long history of being low-protein, macronutrient generalists, with certain individuals, like primarily carnivorous barren-ground grizzlies, being an exception much rather than the rule. Even bears like polar bears preferentially eat the fat of their pinniped prey before any meat, and so are adapted for a high-fat diet despite being obligate predators, as the two foodstuffs are different macronutrient profiles. The same is true of sloth bears and their fatty termite diet too. This is also now believed to be why bears can produce so much bile. And almost all bears will have carbohydrate, plant and fruit matter as a major seasonal or principal permanent part of their diet too. Of the 13 known brute species, where their subspecies and variants and so on will be lumped into as well, 5 are hypercarnivorous, with no known variation in diet. 5 are herbivorous with some minor protein and fat content. 2 chiefly consume mixed fat and protein through either bones or invertebrates, and 1 eats rock. So the dedicated carnivores aren't representative of the entire family, and thusly the family may not and shouldn't be viewed in the same vein bears once were, as a carnivorous group with a weird panda wyvern or two, but rather a generalist low-protein group with a hypercarnivorous clade and a few instances of that evolving at other periods too, in response to resource scarcity. This may be a key to brute wyvern success, with the species having reasonable success in the Old and New Worlds and at least some of wherever the Forbidden Lands is, with a low species diversity but high species success and prevalence. The high carbohydrate eating smaller brutes may be responsible for brute success and family survival as much as any rampaging carnivorous tyrannosaur-like giant too. For the rampaging and carnivorous giant Brachydios though, how does it actually use its pounders and slime for hunting, and how common are large prey? Whilst often suggested to be killing and feeding on other large volcanic monsters, such specimens are rare, dangerous, and often have a superior ability to Brachydios to utilise molten lava areas too. They're likely just not common enough full stop, nor in terms of encounter rates, to specialise into for something like Brachydios. Individually, they may still make up important feeding events in terms of biomass consumed. A Brachydios that successfully kills a Uragan will be able to feed for at least a week and possibly several on the body, but in terms of head of game killed per year, large prey may not be the most common. Rather, their youngsters may be. The precocious young of many volcanic monsters are far more common than the adults, and also handily live in groups too. Brachydios is seen hunting juvenile Agnactor, and for the burrowing subadults of various monsters, both the slime and pounding provide useful tools to unearth them from volcanic rock. The fact monsters like Euroctor or Cenotors are often together means Brachydios would get more bang for its buck, and likely unearths a small group of them for a more profitable meal, rather than getting them one at a time, that would presumably prove energetically untenable. As discussed last time too, juvenile Gravios could provide a rewarding challenge to unearth as well, if Brachydios can detect them when hidden. Smaller prey items like Renoplos and Gastodon are also mentioned canonically in the Iceborne book as well, so overall it does seem to be the case that for all its explosive hype, the most frequently caught Brachydios prey are smaller monsters, and some predators can make surprisingly good livings off small prey. For barren ground grizzlies, who have a far larger size difference between their occasional prey of ground squirrels than Brachydios does with the Euroctor, can get a large chunk of their summer protein intake from them, with the squirrels providing a reliable and sedentary food source. Squirrels may pick up the slack from other larger protein sources like caribou as well, as Euroctor and Cenotors may do when compared to large volcanic monsters instead. The considerable digging activity of bears can have minor positive impacts on the tundra plant communities, and a small handful of plants may be dependent on bear activity for their growth and spreading. But overall, the strong abiotic factors that affect tundra landscapes likely minimize the impact of much of the life there, and the same may be true of volcanoes too. Less productive ecosystems are less affected by their fauna, even if they have typically strong impacts elsewhere. With the constant volcanicity of the volcanic belt, Ingalile and Elder's Recess, even the megafaunal cast of monsters may have little impact against constant lava flows, eruptions and tectonic shifts, constantly reshaping such areas. So the bioturbation of rock that many volcanic monsters do may only have minimal long-term impacts. In the short term though, it could be that certain species benefit from such disturbances, and the diggings of Brachydios and other species could provide ephemeral homes for nitroshrooms, fire herbs and other volcanic life that likely grow quickly in such hostile and changeable environments. The use of the pounders and the slime is a pretty unique way of killing, and some have compared it to real animals like the mantis or pistol shrimps, erroneously. Pistol shrimps are called as such due to the fact their claw mechanisms compress and then cause cavitation in a small jet of water shot out of a small space very quickly. Essentially, they make a bullet out of water to shoot from the claw on contact, like one of those gun brass knuckles you often see in fiction. Mantis shrimps do clobber their prey to death, but this is where they differ from Brachydios. There may be some localized cavitation due to the pitting on the claws, but really the greater number is the strength of the shrimp, with most cavitation impacts actually being around half the impact of the initial blow, although in some instances they can get higher. It also damages the shrimp and has to be repaired by molting, and so may actually be an unwanted but manageable side effect over some Sigma finishing move. Both of these are dependent on fluid dynamics and cavitation. Brachydios is clearly far less competent in a melee without its slime, with it being shown that its physical blows against Agnactor do essentially nothing, and it's hard carried by its slime in that particular face-off. It only seems to combine the two for a cinematic finish, and more typically slimes up a large prey item in combat, and lets that kill or neutralize them before going in for the double tap once they're moribund. Not at all like a mantis shrimp. So it seems Brachydios may well eat more smaller monsters than first thought. And some of this also partially brings up the topic of parental care in the volcano, and why everyone seems to be ducking it in that particular biome. For a start, it is canonically hard to do even for fire wyverns like Rathian, and even Gravios seems to leave the volcano to bear its young. It's unknown if Glavenus will have their young in a volcano or if the females leave it, and if Uragon shows parental care, but it doesn't seem likely based on its closest relative Radoban. So many volcanic monsters don't show parental care, including Brachydios, and in purely terms of their offspring they seem more R-selected, with a lot of small young they don't look after that have low survival rates. Brachydios apparently do, and with how often Euroctors seem to die from larger monsters, it can be assumed they don't have especially high survival rates either. So essentially, no volcanic large monsters exhibit parental care. The why of this could stem from several reasons, some shared and some different. Or eating monsters may exhibit no parental care from a mix of both their basic foraging and ontogenetic niche partitioning. The biomass-eating offspring likely have different needs to their rock-eating parents, and so would learn little from foraging with them. Or eating may also need no real teaching or learning from adult to young. The adults may also not have sufficient food to eat in the areas their young prefer, and the young may not survive the adult journeys through the volcano or may also starve in the more barren areas. Some studies show that more R-selected traits are favoured in unstable environments, and in this regard the constant volcanic and elder activity in the volcanic belt and Elder's Recess would likely count them as pretty unstable environments as well. Whilst the resident large monsters aren't truly R-selected, their treatment of offspring does share some R-selected traits, and the initial reason for many species may be that slow-growing, sedentary and altricial young fare poorly in such environments. For Brachydios, the slime and its prevalence in the environment is just another factor of unpredictability. Age at which they first encounter it, how strong it is, density, and so on. The shell that slime can feed on may be the triggering factor for its growth and explosive blooming, and may be why other organisms aren't detonated at random by it, but young Brachydios occasionally are. Areas where their parents are active are presumably too high in mature, powerful slime mold early on, and so were initial prompt for the abandonment of fledgling parental care behaviours. As the baby Brachydios grow, their shell changes with them. Artwork of a baby shows it almost like a set of scutes in a pale blue scaly skin, before it becomes the more recognisable uniform armour plating of the adult. As the wyvern matures, both the blasts from their budding slime and the heat from the volcanic surroundings seemingly warp and reshape the shell, turning it from the scutes to the plates. Whilst this doesn't really happen in any known species, it's not unheard of in terms of physical properties based on organisms. Based on thermophile proteins as natted about last time, one hydrogel has been developed that hardens into a far more durable plastic-like solid from an otherwise weak slime with no increase in volume when exposed to heat. It's believed this may have significance for personal protection in motorsport and hobbies, and would also likely be a fair analogue for Brachydios' shell formation over time. The shell may also be analogous to cornified or keratinous tissue, and maybe dead structure over skin, which would also support the idea of slime feeding on it. Brachydios may rely on both the slime and natural wear and tear to keep its shell looking as it does and not overgrowing. Young Brachydios may be worse protected than adults for a fair portion of their lives, but are considerably more flexible, and may use their greater mobility from the unfused scutes to hide from and outmaneuver potential predators until large enough to withstand attack. Rare individuals with immensely powerful slime, called Flashpoint, are known to the guild, and are called Raging Brachydios. And these individuals may be as big a problem for other Brachydios as they are for hunters as well. Female Brachydios have slime too, and there seems to be little sexual dimorphism and mutual mate choice in Brachydios, with both sexes apparently being more attracted to brighter coloured slime on the opposite. And in this regard, raging might provide something of a trap, with the flashpoint slime acting as a supernormal stimulus. This is anything that provides an exaggerated form of a certain stimuli that demands a certain response, with supernormal stimuli demanding a higher preference than normal stimuli due to just looking unnaturally attractive. So it's likely that Brachydios of the opposite sex are highly attracted to raging individuals far more than normal individuals. This would be fine if they could withstand the flashpoint slime. However, it seems they can't, so any mating or slime transfer that occurs during it may well prove fatal to their partner when they actually prime and detonate it. Even if the adults survive and are in condition to successfully give birth after, unlikely, then an area saturated in flashpoint slime almost certainly kills the young Brachydios. The Iceborne book seemingly confirming only larger adults can withstand flashpoint once past maturity. So raging individuals essentially eradicate their own offspring, and so reduce the likelihood of other Brachydios reaching the similarly large sizes for raging individuals to become more prevalent. In an earlier video on bird wyverns, the concept of keystone individuals were discussed, typically in positive senses on how they altered things for the group in terms of larger prey acquisition, or competitive dominance. But keystone individuals can be uniquely negative too, causing declines in success for groups by being too aggressive, or by being pathogen superspreaders. Raging Brachydios may be such keystone individuals, essentially functioning as a one wyvern population sink for their kind, and even causing localized extinctions as they both spread lethal flashpoint slime and lure in reproductively available partners to their doom, or at least prevent breeding. Ingle may have once been a thriving population that was later decimated by the prevalence of a single raging individual. The same could have, or may be potentially happening in the Guiding Lands too. The unique speciated slime and Brachydios are now essentially dependent on one another, and whilst the slime may lie dormant in the ground at times, it may not be able to reproduce without Brachydios, and may only exist in its active state on Brachydios itself. This partnership is not so unusual. As said before, organisms can also be ecosystems, and many species will have dependents that are only found on one life form. The fates of Brachydios and its slime may now be tied forevermore. So Brachydios is a monster I'm far from a fan of, and at the time was generally viewed as something of an extreme departure from the typical designs of the series, mainly because he was. But before anything else, I think it can be worthwhile to look into why, and I personally believe it has something to do with Tri. After a pretty successful set of sales for portable 2nd gen, Tri didn't do well. Whilst Monster Hunter has always languished in the West especially, Tri was heavily geared towards Western sales and general success, with release on the best-selling console at the time and a only now famous ad campaign too. Overall, it must have stung to see how badly it did. Whilst Ichinose was just generally doing his own thing, full stop, but also with the port known as Portable 3, Brachydios was made by Mainline, often used as a rebuttal to the idea of portable crazy in anime and mainline restrained and natural. As such, Brachydios is essentially the anti-Tri monster. Tri's main theme is to one with life, and it was the game in the series thus far with the biggest focus on ecology and the natural world. The monsters now had far more ecology baked into their fights with map interactions and stamina, meaning they had to eat, and thus be given specialised diets. In the story, you don't kill Brachydios. You essentially help him by freeing him from torment. In the very opening, the promised showdown between Rathalos and Lagiacrus ends in, well, it doesn't even start. Like two reasonably matched top predators, there's a lot of bluster and no real fight, with both allowing to live and let live. Brachydios is made in opposition to all of that. His ecology scene is literally just a fight, with no bluster and all explosive combat, as an actor repeatedly fumbles every advantage he has to try and convince the audience of Brachydios' lethality. You could argue some Ether ecology cutscenes are similarly violent before this. Baroth just kills a great Jaggy, but only after we see it disturbing the peace. Baroth is otherwise fine with the Aptonoth being there, and inadvertently protects them by getting rid of the other Wyvern. Brachydios has no map interactions, his diet is just meat. In his lore, he's so destructive and explosive their own offspring are often killed by the slime and they don't show parental care. He sticks out like a sore thumb compared to how most of the other monsters were implemented. The arguable exception is Deviljho, who is similarly violent in lore but is different in gameplay due to his role as the first bespoke invader. Though with the slime/oil Deviljho concept art, it could be that the two had at least some overlap in their initial design inspirations. Part of this may also come from other possible inspirations too, with various demolitions obviously being a big part of it, but also somewhat resembling that thing from that little niche anime, Neon Genesis or whatever it is, that was essentially a big robot made to kill giant monsters that also entered a violent berserk state. The two even had a crossover where this resemblance was highlighted. There is also the Leviathan Brachy too, where at least some aspects of him were initially conceived as a Leviathan over a brood. The idea of a strike and retreat blast monster is an interesting one, and feels like something the art team repeatedly want to try and float, only to repeatedly get something that happily wallows in its own explosions instead. Oh well, at least they finally got their platypus monster. Whether or not Brachydios was made directly in response to Tri won't be found out until Fujioka answers my DMs, but in general I think 4th gen was. 3U was a bit of a messy game, that we now know literally started as a Plesioth port, and then got Portable Thirds content too. Likely some of this content for both games was made with 4 in mind, hence why there's an unusual amount of roster overlap between 3rd and 4th gen. And 4th gen is less about nature, and more trying to be an attempt at a typical big-budget action narrative, to save the world from the evils of Gore and Shagaru on a globe-trotting adventure with a huge, and so less bespoke, roster. It's far less restrained and focused than Tri, and many monsters have less environmental interactions compared to it. I've said before I think Tri was something of an attempt to course-correct, following the reception of Elders in DOS, and so 4 may be another attempt at course correction to Tri's middling reception, to try and make a game more typically action-adventure and less hardline on ecology and nature. But for Brachydios himself, a lot of this is why I find him pretty tiresome. He's just an inherently power-scaled monster at his core, whilst also being inherently stupid in how he does it. Literally the only thing developers seem to say about him behind the scenes is just how strong he is and how he's stronger than everyone else. That really does just sum it up as a monster with really nothing else to say, other than it's cool and has explosions. The anti-Tri monster indeed. I've said a lot about just generally how stupid and broken Brachydios is in a lot of ways, and I don't really want to rehash that here. Rather, there's plenty more crap things about him to go over in general. On to design. And design-wise I also think he's pretty weird in a bad way. Brachydios has always looked weirdly stumpy and compressed for reasons I can't quite put my finger on. With his weird mouth, short tail and big blocky arms, he just really resembles one of those cheap plastic dinosaur toys you used to get, albeit one that got coated in superglue and fell through an Ann Summers shop. The horn in general adds little to the fight and less to the design overall, even if it does technically have the lore point of being a seemingly crucial point for the slime to breed. With the armour pseudo-teeth and the scarcely necessary tail weapon, he generally has a lot of things that really work on other monsters, but look unfeasibly goofy on him. Fight-wise, I used to genuinely quite enjoy Brachydios, but I've definitely cooled on him post-Basil Juice. Fighting both a lot and comparing the two, even if Basil's bombs are actually fire element and not blast, weird choice. The way Basil uses his bombs is simultaneously a more challenging and yet more enjoyable way of utilising explosives in a fight than the slime. Now, in comparison, Brachy just feels like a bit of a repetitive chore, even if the slime isn't as annoying as it was in 3U. I think a lot of this is hammered in even more with just how mediocre Brachydios was implemented in Iceborne too. Whilst a lot of the returners were there more for fan service and general content, over complementing what base world set up, some did better than others, and with the exception of maybe Narg fight-wise, they all did better than Brachydios. He essentially feels non-updated fight-wise, now has a weird sound design with a lot of farmyard animal noises without any mixing, gets nothing to do environmentally as is par for the course. He really is just sort of there. Another glorified cameo really. If nothing else though, I do think Brachydios' theme is really good. Genuinely one of the best. And one of the best for a workout or even filthy cardio too. Like with some monsters it can line up perfectly with some of his moves, and when it lines up with the punch charge it is really just phenomenal. Despite my dislike for Brachydios, I'm not necessarily against a punchy explodey monster. I think Brachydios or something like it, design and fight wise, should be something with all of its offense and defense up front where it counts, with a weak and unarmoured backside with a relatively ineffective tail. Problem is, in terms of its core fight mechanic, this already exists, and it's called pre-5th gen Rajang. To talk about brutes too, as Brachydios is the final brute wyvern to be covered until after Wild's release, they're a family that's definitely not quite as diverse as the flying wyverns due to their dependency on the theropod-like body structure for their class. But there's still plenty avenues to go down. Whilst some are saturated, Glavenus and Duramboros have the bladed and blunt aspects of tail weaponry nailed, and for biting, Joe and Anjanath have it covered, as well as the Baroth and Bambaro duo for ramming and charging, to saturate the damage from the front niche. But forelimb-wise, only Brachydios is present, and his fight is as or more notable for slime as much as punching. A more bladed approach to forelimb combat with a Therizinosaur, Iguanodon or Spinosaur-like brute could be a way for the future. For the latter, if water combat returns, then brutes could and should spec into that arena too. Water combat's greatest flaw was that it was seemingly made just for leviathans. More skeletons and monster families should be on it, brutes included. There's also full-body brutes, in the way that Uragan and Radoban are defined by the full-body action of rolling. So more could be in a similar theme. You could have a lanky, kick-based brute as well, and maybe even the Tigrex of brute wyverns, one that switches between quadrupedal movement and bipedal, like old depictions of Rhysuchians as a notion of an old brute ancestor that survived to modern times. I think Chemetries looks good, but I also can't deny it does seem to borrow heavily from other already existing brutes in Glavenus and Anjanath, and it does seem brutes do have a lower variety ceiling than some other monsters. With the amount of weird birds and fish one can draw inspiration from for fights, piscines and birds are well covered, even if so far the class is dominated by sharks and raptors. But as said, there are plenty more routes that can still be taken, and surely the class will provide plenty more monsters to come. Thanks for watching, and as ever a huge thanks to my patrons: Toxic Wolf, The Superest Duper, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Eringar Steiner, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Nathan Cross, Tim Gojira, Dapperaptor, Bonecrusher Hyena, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Dudekablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu, whose donations help keep the channel going. There's a link in the description for any interested in signing up, and any amount is always appreciated. Thanks too to Carmen Rider Moten and Dragonmaster for supplying the digital artworks for this video. A link to all of Carmen's social media is provided in the description below for you to check out, and there are plenty more pieces not featured in the video. Thanks to I Am the Kaiju King, who provided both the Brachydios skull, but also the custom line art for Brachydios, its suggested ancestor, and their respective environments. Be sure to check out their Tumblr for more original artwork, theories, and monster anatomy. Thanks too to Goji for providing translated lore and higher quality copies of the Ecology booklet artwork. For a comment or two from the last video, the Red Voyager pointed out that the columnar jointing as seen in the Elder's Recess is unique to basalts, and so the Elder's Recess almost certainly has much hotter and more basaltic magma, possibly compared to the Old World volcanic belt too. This could potentially provide another reason for Gravios' absence, and that of some other monsters like Agnactor too, who could be less adapted to the even more extreme temperatures. Between this video and the last, the volcanic megafauna of Monster Hunter have finally received some attention, although it's more by chance they occurred one after the other. With the general extremity of volcanic monsters, they're quite hard to talk about in this regard, and with Oceanus soon to cover 3rd gen and so Agnactor with its canonical lore, unless they get a serious implementation in Wilds, Agnactor and Lavasioth aren't likely to get a video anytime soon. Only joking, of course. Lavasioth was never getting one. Next time will be another non-Monster Hunter video, and hopefully a shorter one compared to these last few which have been a bit lengthy, when I didn't mean for them to be. But as ever, I hope I'll see you there for it.